Okay, hello everyone. Let's just take a few moments just to wait for everyone to come in, just so we're not missing out. Okay, wonderful. All right, yes, hello everyone. Thank you all for attending Educational App Store's monthly webinar on how to introduce books to your child and encourage storytelling today. We're delighted to have everyone here. Just to inform everybody before we get properly started, we'll be recording today's session and sending the recording to all of our attendees and registrants. We'll also be sharing it in our newsletter and social medias next week. Our presentation today should be approximately 20 minutes, which will be followed by a 10-minute Q&A session. So it is with great pride that I introduce you all to Michael Rosenberg, our speaker today. Michael is an entrepreneur, traveler, and importantly for this webinar, a writer. His illustrious career took him all over the world, traveling to many countries from South America to Africa and Asia. Here, he learned a great deal about different cultures and business practices as a result, and had many adventures in the course of his travels, including, in 1982, co-founding the first commercial breakfast TV station in the UK, together with his friend, the late Sir David Frost. He began writing for children some 10 years ago, mainly to entertain his grandchildren, and uses his extensive travelling experience as the background for his stories, all of which have educational merits to help children understand environmental issues and different cultures. So, further ado, take it away, Michael.
Thank you, Thea, for that kind introduction. One of the only advantages of getting older is that you have a lot of stories to tell. And I've been lucky and I've had a fairly colorful career, as Thea mentioned, having traveled the world. I actually just very quickly started off in the world of banking and then moved to co-found a healthcare business. And that took me as a kind of semi-ambassador for British Health all over the world, traveling into not just to the cities, but into the interiors of places like Peru, up the Amazon, into Africa, into various places. And I saw and learnt a great deal, particularly about different cultures. And I'm aware that today I think I'm speaking to a multi-diverse group of people from around the world, which is even more interesting. But basically, I think wherever we are, wherever we're placed, we all have the same objectives for our kids, which is to help them to mature and understand the world that they're living in. It's getting more and more, in one sense, more and more difficult and challenging. On the other hand, with social media and today's means of communication, in theory, it should become easier for the kids to understand how other people live. But my books, which as Thea said, were inspired by the arrival in my life of my grandchildren, have all been designed not just to be entertaining, but to try and bring a little bit of understanding to children about different cultures, about the world in which they live, and sprinkled with a few adventures, which in a way mirror what I've experienced. Interestingly, I used my grandson, who's now reached the ripe old age of 18, but way back when I first started, I sent him a draft of one of my books. He was then about 7 or 8, I think, or maybe 9. And he came back and said, "Look, Grandpa, your stories are great. I love them, and I'll certainly tell my friends. But do you know that you're not very good at grammar?" And he asked me, he said, "Do I understand? Would I understand what a comma is?" And I said, "Well, I think I do." He said, "Well, let me explain." He says, "A comma is when you take a short breath, and a full stop is when you take a long breath. And then he paused for effect and said, "You know what? You don't have too many commas." So, so I was being educated by my grandchildren at that point, which was the reverse of what I'd intended. The books that I've created, when I first started, people asked me, "Well, how did you imagine the books, and how did you focus upon stories that kids would enjoy?" And the answer to that is I tried to make them as colorful as possible, but also to relate to their imagination. And I went round to schools and talked to schools and talked to classes. And one of the things that I did was, after explaining a little bit about some of my books, I would say to the kids, "Now tell me, have you guys got any stories in your mind you'd like to tell me?" And the really interesting thing was that on several occasions, at least one or two or even more kids put their hands up and said, "Oh, I've got a story to tell." And they would get up and tell a little story. And it kind of inspired me in a way, because I could see that what I'd done was to inspire them to be creative, which is, at the end of the day, I think, what we'd all enjoy. Of course, today, with modern technology, lots of the books that you will find, and there are thousands of them, are interactive and have lots of means of interactivity. But I still think that the standard book, the classical book, which tells a story or stories, can be made interesting by the parents or by the teachers reading the story, without necessarily getting into the IT that accompanies many of them. So the first book that I wrote was called The Story of Bendelot, and you may ask, why Bendelot? Bendelot I invented as a village high up in the mountains of Kazakhstan, where the people had been remote and had no idea that anyone else in the world existed, until one day a little boy is blown into their world by a tornado, and they go on an adventure to discover the rest of the world. And that got me thinking, because he took them on a journey in which they discovered the different cultures, different people, but also made them use their imagination. We have a friendly giant with 10 fingers. We have flying pigs. We have all kinds of creatures that I've invented. And that, I found, really stimulated the kids to come back and ask me questions. How did you think of that? Where did that idea come from? And it's interesting, I don't know how many of you know, but there's a very famous individual still alive called Uri Geller, who has fascinated the world for many years by being able to bend metal with his mind. He claims to be real. I've seen him do it, and I'm kind of persuaded. So I created this village in this imaginary place where everyone had that ability to bend things. And from that came the story. Soon after that, after following that story through, I met a lady at a social gathering, and she told me a story. She said, "You know what? I have a 24-year-old son who is still attached to the little toy polar bear that he had when he was 5 years old. And he carries it everywhere, wherever he goes. And invariably, he forgets it, or he loses it, and it gets lost." And that inspired me to create another series called Chili the Lost Polar Bear. And that really, I found, in a way, even more interesting, because I take this little toy polar bear to different countries. He's been to South Africa, where he falls off the back of a lorry, off the safari jeep, and is rescued by an elephant. He goes to Hong Kong, where, those of you who know, there's the Star Ferry, which he falls off into a fishing boat and gets taken to China, and he learns about China and different cultures in China, learns about chopsticks and how they eat. And he's been to Peru, where he's met the speckled bears, who were the origins of Paddington Bear, who's quite a famous character in the UK and maybe elsewhere, indeed with our late Queen. And so he's been all over the place. He's been to Australia, where he got captured by the dingoes and then rescued. So all the stories have a base in countries that I've been to, that I've experienced, stories that I've kind of invented, but are not that far removed from the truth. So those are the kind of stories that I've developed. One other just out of interest, because I'm quite musical and I love music, and I think kids can react and can relate to music. I have one story called The Little Lost Tune, and that's really to help kids to understand the meaning of musical notes. And in this story, the conductor raises his baton, and as he raises his baton, the notes fly off the paper because they weren't glued properly by the fairies. And my characters have to go through a forest and pick up the notes and put them back together again to make music. So you will see from the way that I've described this that all of my stories have both an educational and indeed the environmental side to them as well, because I try and encourage people to understand that, first of all, there are other worlds. Again, in one of my stories, I have created a planet where the characters in that planet spend their time going around galaxies trying to rescue people from the terrible things they're doing with their worlds and trying to stop them from destroying their worlds. So all of these stories have an educational side to them, they have a cultural side to them, and hopefully they'll have an entertaining side to them. Now, people have asked me, one of the questions was, how important is reading aloud to kids? Well, I've done that. I've been to schools, and I've obviously not read the whole book, but I've read extracts from the book, and it's fascinating to see how the kids react to hearing the story live. I've also done it with my own grandchildren and actually with other people's grandchildren. And all I can tell you is the reaction I get is almost invariably positive. Sometimes they fall asleep, of course, which may be the objective in some cases, but basically, I think if you have the ability to connect with either your kids or your grandkids and tell the story with a little bit of color and excitement, you'll find that they will react and they will become creative themselves. So one of the other questions was, how do you choose the right books for your child? That's a really difficult question. You only have to go into a bookstore anywhere in the world to see the thousands of titles which are out there. And the honest answer, as much as I would love you all to buy my books, is that there are many, many good books out there designed for children. And of course, it has a great deal to do with age. I mean, depends whether you're talking to a 3-year-old or a 13-year-old. I mean, their interests will differ. For the young kids, the one thing I've learned is for the very young kids, the span of attention, as I think most parents will know, is pretty limited. And if you carry on for much more than about 10 minutes or 15 minutes, they will either get bored or fall asleep, however interesting you try to make it. So for the very, very young kids, they're more interested in the illustrations, in the color of the story, and the ability to understand what's happening in a more interesting way. For the older children, of course, and I grew up reading books. I don't know how many of your parents are bookworms as I was, but I was always surrounded by books of all kinds for as long as I can remember. And interestingly, my grandson, who I say is now 18, comes round regularly, and he looks at my little library, always goes away with at least 2 books because he loves reading books and always has. And maybe that's why he's managed to get to university, but I'm sure there are other reasons. So choosing a book for children has to do with age and maybe a little bit to do with ethnicity and culture, and where you are and what type of kid you are, from what background they come. So my only advice is go into the store, have a browse. There's no easy answer, frankly. Find a book that you think that you can relate to, and I'm sure that the kids will enjoy them. One of the other questions was, was, does telling stories help kids learn? I'm sure it does. I have no doubt about it. I think that the ability to, as I say, to be creative and to stimulate a fertile brain. I mean, it doesn't matter what the interest of the kid happens to be. Most children will react to a story, whether they are artistic or whether they're practical. I mean, everyone's born with different talents, which is fine. But I think most people should relate to books. It's very sad, actually. I was watching a TV program the other day, one of these quiz shows, and one of the contestants was asked a question that related to an author of a book, and he looked blank. And when the question master said, "Well, do you not have an answer?" He says, "I've never read books." This was a guy of, I don't know, in his 40s. He had never read a book, which I found just extraordinary. But hopefully that's not a good example of the majority of people, because I really do believe that most people have got enjoyment from a book somewhere. So that's the background. It's quite interesting that as my kids got older, as my grandchildren got older, and one of them, when he got to the age of 11, he said, "You know, Grandpa, your books are lovely. They're very enjoyable, but you've got to write books for older children." So I then set myself the task of writing a story for what I would call the younger adults, say 11 to 14, that sort of range of age. And I called it The Fabulous Fanshaws, and that creates an imaginary world, a parallel universe, where the main character, who comes from a long line of aristocratic knights, but has fallen upon hard times, wishes he could go back to that time. In fact, using his imagination, he ends up in a parallel universe as a knight in shining armor again, but using modern technology. So that's my latest story, The Fabulous Fanshaws, which again, it certainly stimulated me, and I think it's a fairly recent book that I've just published, and hopefully will stimulate others. So that's my story so far. I'd be very happy to take questions.
Fabulous. Thank you very much for that, Michael. That was a fantastic presentation and really shed some light on your background and also your writing process. Now, some of our attendees have sent in some questions for you that you have touched on. And while we do only have time for a couple of them, if anyone has any further questions, you're more than welcome to include them in the chat or send them over to us, and we will forward those over to Michael to answer directly. So first of all, Michael, one of the questions we had was, how do you encourage children to talk about and engage with books and with reading?
That is clearly a task both for the parents and, might I say, also for their teachers, because I would hope that once they reach some kind of school age, and that maybe the young school age, that the teachers will really seek to encourage them to read books and to come back and to comment on those books and to explore what happened and be critical about them. So I think that is clearly the job of the teachers and hopefully to a large extent of the parents, because my parents encouraged me to read books. Mind you, at that time we did. I'm old enough to say that we didn't have television, so we had to read books or listen to the radio. So there wasn't a choice. And I know today all the kids have smartphones and all kinds of pads or whatever, and they're all too busy swiping the phone or swiping the pad. But having said that, I think there is still room, a lot of room, frankly, as was discovered by, for example, the Harry Potter series, J.K. Rowling. I mean, who would have thought that could have been so successful with films that followed on? And that started out with his books. And it took her, as we know, nearly 10 years to be discovered. But when she did, it has become a worldwide phenomenon. So that and others like it demonstrate there is a market. And today it's quite interesting. Almost every celebrity you hear about is writing a children's book. I mean, they all seem to have set their mind to writing children's books, and fine. I mean, it's competition to my books, but I'm very happy with that because I think the more that we can encourage children to read books, the better.
Yes, absolutely. Somewhat connected to that, the conversation about, children on devices and that sort of thing. Do you think there's a substantial difference between reading physical books and reading books on those devices, for example, iPads and Kindles and that sort of thing?
They have a place, and I'm definitely not against the iPads and the use of interactivity and bringing the book to life in that way. But at the same time, I think to me, there's nothing so satisfying as sitting in a quiet corner and just reading a book and being able to absorb it. I mean, personally, but it's probably an age thing, I find it easier to read print than read on a screen. I just find that much easier, even in business, to be honest. So that may be just because of my age, I'm not sure. But I like to think that actually there will always be a place for books. And my understanding of the book world just generally is that book sales have increased, particularly during the pandemic when a lot of people were isolated at home or wherever.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, this is a question from one of our attendees, and they ask, what questions do you think you should ask after reading a story with children? Like, what kind of questions should we ask our children to see that they're engaging with what they're reading?
Well, it works both ways. In the cases where I've, if you like, taken a class and read them extract from a story, the questions come back like machine guns. Actually, they want to know how I've invented the character, why that character is what is described as he is. Why did he go and why did he go down that particular path? Why couldn't he have done something else? So I've found that just by introducing a few questions, for example, I might say, okay, my Chili, my lost polar bear is in the jungle. Why do you think he's in the jungle? And does anyone know what a jungle is? And you'd be surprised. I mean, I did ask one kid in a class actually, does anyone know where Kazakhstan is? Thinking that maybe one or two people with their hands up. They all put their hands up and told me exactly where it was, which was extraordinary. And they were stimulated by it because they then said, well, where is this village? Can you show us where the village is? And I had to explain that it's an imaginary one. But so you can easily do that, I think, just by pinpoint a few areas. I mean, in Australia, for example, I talk about my character being captured by the dingoes. So the question is, so what is dingo? How did you find a dingo?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that also kind of connects to the subject of encouraging children's imagination through reading as well, being able to have those questions answered and being able to speak openly about a reading experience with your children. Do you think there's anything else to kind of encourage children's imagination by reading?
I'm not sure. I think if you've created caused the creativity to make them think, and I would always say after reading, I would always say, why don't you go away and try and think up of a story to tell me, and encourage them to do that. And which is what used to happen to me years ago. Actually, we were encouraged to write essays and stories or whatever. It doesn't matter how basic it is, to be honest. I mean, it's fine. And even to get them to act out a scene, to say, why don't you pretend to be this character? And let's see what you do. I had, mind you, in one of the classes I spoke to at the end, the teacher said, well, I think we'll wind up now. One of the little kids put his hand up. So I have one more question. I said, what is the question? He says to me, do you live in a big house? So I said, well, I live in a reasonably large house, but if you're daddies and mummies buy my books, I could get a bigger house.
Fantastic.
So you never know where the stories are going to come from.
Absolutely. Now, this is a question from me as chairperson privilege. What would you say would be the best story that you've heard from these groups that you've spoken to?
Oh, the best story. That's a hard one, actually. Um, I think actually my original book, which was the Bendelow book, did contain a great deal to do both with culture and environment and cleaning up planets. And I think that stimulated the kids a great deal to understand the problems that this planet may get itself into if we're not too careful.
Mm, yeah, absolutely. And to just go into a final question from one of our attendees, and perhaps a very important question to touch on. Why is reading so important for young children, and what can we do as parents, as educators, to build up the habit of reading?
Yes, well, it is an important question, and the answer to that, as I think I said earlier on, is it it needs to come from both sides. It needs to come from the parents, and it needs to come from the classroom. And I think that's the only way you're going to encourage me, and maybe to a certain extent from the media. That's a little bit more difficult because you've got to find the right way of focusing it. But I think that if there was more in the media about the importance of books and the importance of reading, and maybe well, I mean, I like reading the critics of all kinds of books in the newspapers. If you read them, whether it's children or adults for that matter, that encouraged me to go out and buy a book, which I do. So I think it's a job for the media, it's a job for teachers, and it's a job for parents.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we all have a responsibility to kind of introduce that love of reading to our younger generations. So
Absolutely.
fabulous.
Yeah.
Great. So some excellent answers to our questions. And once again, if there are any questions that have not been answered, please feel free to post them in the chat or send them our way, and we will pass them on to Michael. So I think that wraps up today's webinar. Michael, thank you ever so much for taking the time to speak for us today. A big thank you to all of our attendees for, well, attending today. And just as a reminder, the recording of today's session will be sent over to you as soon as it's available and included in our newsletter next week as well. So I think that's everything. Take care, everyone, and we look forward to hosting the next Educational App Store webinar. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening.
Thank you. Thank you.